One minute Trump is telling the world peace is close. The next minute, an American warship is on the radio telling a vessel in the Gulf to vacate its engine room or prepare for disabling fire. That is not just a contrast. That is the whole problem. Because if you want to understand China's endgame in the Iran war, you have to start with that split image. America keeps saying the war is almost over. America keeps acting like it is about to get bigger. China is standing just outside the fight, watching both things happen at once. And from Beijing's point of view, that is not just chaos. It is opportunity and danger fused together. That is the China paradox. China has stronger reasons than almost anyone on earth to want this war to stop. China is the single biggest destination for crude oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war, nearly 5 million barrels a day transited that corridor on their way to China. Put that in plain English. And it means that around a quarter of China's daily oil consumption depends on a waterway that Iran can disrupt, and the United States can militarize. That is not a side issue in China's energy structure. That is one of its exposed arteries, and it is not just any oil. A meaningful part of it is cheap oil. China signed a 5-year strategic partnership with Iran worth hundreds of billions of dollars across banking, ports, telecoms, rail, energy, and infrastructure. In return, China got what matters most in a world of industrial competition, discounted supply. Not because Beijing was doing Tehran a favor, but because it was a good deal. China needs energy, Iran needs buyers. Both sides knew the transaction made sense. So on the surface, the Chinese position should be simple: end the war, reopen Hormuz, normalize the shipping lanes, get the oil flowing, stabilize the prices, keep the factory floor of the world fed with fuel. That is what common sense says. That is what the headline suggests. That is what a shallow reading of Chinese interests would tell you. And yet, a shallow reading misses the most important thing. China may need this war to stop, but China may also need America to keep mismanaging it a little longer. That is the deeper logic, because Beijing is suffering from the conflict. Yes, but it is also watching the United States do something strategically priceless: discredit itself with its allies, stretch its forces, weaken the image of its own leadership, and make the American-led order look less stable, less trustworthy, and less permanent than it has looked in decades. That is the real prize on the board. The simplest way to put it is this: China wants the war painful enough to expose the limits of American power, but not so catastrophic that the whole world order starts collapsing around Chinese trade. That is a narrow corridor to walk, and that is why China's position is so complicated. Look at how America has chosen to fight. Trump and his officials talk in the language of maximum force, total dominance, and moral certainty. Thousands of targets struck, total control. The fate of Iran in American hands. Then add the mixed signals, the broken ceasefire promises, the threats, the half negotiations, the sudden escalations to allies in Europe, to partners in Asia, to governments across the Middle East. This does not look like the behavior of a calm hegemon managing a crisis. It looks like a power that is still capable of huge destruction, but increasingly incapable of making the destruction produce a stable political outcome that matters far beyond Iran. Because Beijing has spent years trying to convince the world that the United States is no longer the reliable adult in the room. Usually that is hard work. You have to persuade people slowly. You have to point to contradictions. You have to talk about hypocrisy, sanctions, regime change, alliance fatigue, and selective rules. But right now, Washington is doing the work for Beijing. That is why this war is such a strategic opening. America is threatening annexations in one region, tariffs in another, war in another, and then asking allies to trust it as the anchor of global order. Europe hears that and starts wondering whether NATO still means what it used to mean. Asian allies hear it and start wondering whether the security umbrella comes with conditions, moods, and improvisations. Middle Eastern states hear it and start realizing that America's presence can now produce as much volatility as protection, and China does not even have to push very hard. It just has to stand there, call for stability, host phone calls, float vague peace plans, and let the contrast speak for itself. That is the first half of China's endgame: be the stable counter image. Not necessarily the moral power. Not necessarily the beloved power, just the more predictable one, the one that looks less hysterical, less combustible, less likely to drag everybody into chaos because its own leadership cannot decide whether it is ending a war or enlarging it. That is an enormous geopolitical asset in a world tired of shock. Now add the second half. China does not only want America to look unstable, China wants the American system to start looking structurally expensive, costly, wasteful, self-defeating. Look at what the Iran war is forcing Washington to spend. Ships, interceptors, air defense, political capital, alliance patience, media credibility, domestic patience. America is burning through hard assets and soft assets at the same time. It is spending money, ammunition, reputation, and trust. And even when it scores tactical gains, the political meaning of those gains keeps slipping. A ceasefire is announced and then half breaks. A deal is said to be near and then vanishes. A blockade is framed as pressure and then starts looking like escalation without exit. That is exactly the kind of war China wants the United States to own. Not because Beijing loves the violence, Beijing hates the instability, but because every extra week of American entanglement in a conflict with unclear political objectives gives China room elsewhere. Room in Asia, room in Europe, room in the Gulf, room in the global South, room to tell every nervous government in the world. Look carefully. The country that says it guarantees order is now manufacturing disorder faster than it can control it. That is why the Middle East matters so much to China. Even beyond oil, Chinese exports to the region have surged over the last decade. Electric vehicles, construction materials, electronics, consumer goods, industrial equipment, China is now deeply embedded in the economic future of the Gulf. It is also investing in desalination, logistics, ports, and digital infrastructure. This is not a temporary trade story. This is Beijing quietly building itself into the region's commercial nervous system. And what does it need for that project to work? Not war, but not American mastery either. What it needs is an environment in which regional governments increasingly hedge away from Washington and toward diversified partnerships with China positioned as the most obvious economic partner in the room. That is the sweet spot. A frightened region that still functions. A wounded American prestige that does not fully collapse. A world order strained enough to create openings, but not shattered enough to shut Chinese factories and break global demand. That is the paradox, because China cannot let this crisis go too far. This is the part many people who talk about China's grand strategy keep getting wrong. They speak as if Beijing benefits automatically from every American failure everywhere. That is too simple. China is not an offshore empire living off chaos. China is the workshop of the global economy. It exports everything from solar panels to smartphones, from industrial machinery to cheap household goods. That model depends on shipping flows, energy reliability, demand stability, and general confidence that the system still works. If the war in Iran starts ripping up those foundations too badly, China suffers. If oil disruption becomes prolonged enough, China suffers. If the rules of global commerce become too unstable, China suffers. If the confidence that underpins trade, payments, production, and transport begins to evaporate, China suffers. So the same war that opens strategic opportunity also threatens the very platform China rose through. That is why Beijing's behavior looks contradictory on the surface. It wants the fighting to stop. It also wants the Americans to keep paying the political price of the fighting. It wants to help Iran survive. It does not want to become Iran's co-belligerent. It wants to position itself as the grown-up power. It does not want to assume the costs of actually policing the whole system the way America once did. It wants a weaker American-led order. It does not want a total collapse of the order before it has fully built the alternative. That is why the speculation about Chinese weapons transfers matters so much. Because if Beijing is in fact helping Iran strengthen its air defenses, then the logic is not that China wants Iran to win a glorious war. The logic is narrower and colder. Keep Iran from breaking, keep the war from ending on American terms. Keep Washington bleeding credibility. But do all of that from one step back with denial, ambiguity, and distance. That is classic Chinese strategy in this moment. Not direct intervention, not total passivity, managed involvement, enough to shape the balance, not enough to own the battlefield. So what is the end game? It is not Iranian victory. It is not American victory. It is not permanent war. China's best case outcome is a world that comes out of this crisis believing 5 things at once. First, the United States is still dangerous, but no longer reliably wise. Second, America can still destroy, but it can no longer easily convert destruction into stable political outcomes. Third, alliances under Washington are becoming more conditional, more nervous, and more transactional. Fourth, China is not a warrior savior, but it is increasingly the indispensable commercial and diplomatic counterweight. And fifth, the future international system will not be held together by one undisputed superpower, but by hedging, multipolarity, and regional actors buying security one place and prosperity somewhere else. That is the world China wants. Not because it is beautiful, because it is usable in that world. Beijing does not need to replace the United States overnight. It only needs to make the United States less automatic, less central, less trusted, and less able to close every deal by force of habit and force of arms. And that may be exactly what this war is helping China do. So, yes, China wants the conflict to end, but not before the conflict has done enough damage. To the idea that America is still the indispensable grown-up in the room, that is the contradiction. That is the strategy. That is the end game. China wants the storm, but only after the storm has rearranged the furniture of the world.